In the hospital, Dr. Celeste Morgan was a legend. Composed under duress, chaos, a lady with a keen mind, straight lines, and unwavering concentration. Admired her administrators, who looked up to her everyone looked to her as a pillar of grace and stone when her speech could calm a terrified patient's heart rate, and her hands were steady enough to grip a scalpel with divine accuracy. Nobody had ever witnessed her speak up, had ever witnessed her lose control, which is what prevented the rumors from happening, since nobody would ever suspect that the woman who wore immaculate white jackets and chignons in perfect restraint had a terrible, evil secret that only I know about because I was the nurse who found it. Ivy Clark, our 5-year nurse, is an adrenaline addict with little tolerance for I enjoyed speed, mess, and the realism of blood, but I also had a high tolerance for disorder and protocol, with perspiration, as well as unsteady hands. I wasn't polished and didn't play well, but something in me short-circuited the moment I met Dr. Morgan. She was all I detested being controlled and too polished to be genuine, but I was unable to stop, observing how she moved, and how her gaze moved across a space as though she constantly considering something more profound, as seen by the fact her lips seldom moved when she issued commands that were followed without. She captivated and frightened me, but one night she wrecked everything for me. We recently lost a 19-year-old young man in trauma on a Tuesday after midnight. The room was frigid, my gloves were bloody, and Celeste had a chest full of shrapnel that entered screaming and left everyone silent. Standing next to the gurney, with his hands still facing blank, and his eyes fixed on the display that had gone silent after calling time of death and had flatlined 6 minutes prior. Try clicking the thank you button below if you like this content and would like to give the channel further support. You can directly contribute to the channel by using the one with the $ and heart icon with super thanks. The rest of the team filed out, which helps me continue to make amazing movies for you. I removed my gloves gradually, one by one, until it was just the two of us. They turned to face her in the dumpster, and she looked at Dr. Morgan without moving, steadily moved to meet mine. But the expression wasn't what I had anticipated. It wasn't aloof or frigid. It was darkly focused, even yet it was professional. As if she was seeing me for the first time, she whispered in a quiet voice, "You shouldn't stay," since time and what she saw made her feel burned. "Why not?" she questioned. Her mouth twitched as I folded my arms. "Afraid I'll see that you're human too." She said, "No," and the words struck more forcefully than they should have. "I'm afraid I won't be able to keep pretending." She stepped forward, closing the distance between us while feigning to hear what I muttered. 3 intentional actions to avoid touching you each time you yell at me in front of a patient I have not considered bending you over, but just think of how you would sound if I kissed you against the medicine cabinet. This gurney, you're not serious. Every time you roll your eyes at me, my breath leaves my lungs like a punch. She was extremely excellent at concealing it until she said it in a serious tone. Her voice like silk over steel. My pulse was in my throat. I was frozen, and my whole body became acutely aware, given how intimate and strong she felt, even without making physical contact with me. I want you," she added, even though I whispered. "You correct me. You glare at me. What are you doing?" was straightforward. But you already understood that I was gasping for air. "Breaking my own rules," she whispered. "Just this once." She then planted a kiss on my lips, harsh and hard, like if she had been starved and her control had finally given out. I staggered backward and struck the gurney's edge, as everything she had been holding back erupted into that kiss, and she pinned my mouth while following her body, without letting go of my hands. I gasped her name as she seemed to have been waiting years to see Celeste. She hissed into my throat, telling me to stop, because it was foreign to my tongue like a sin. "Tell me, and I'll do it." Instead, I drew her back in, and we didn't reach She pushed away the medical papers and hoisted me to the edge, saying we didn't need a bed, of the table, and gave me a kiss, as if I were a woman who had been too composed. And I knew then that this edge, this need, this fire, it had always been there. Hidden was new to her, concealed within the picture of the patient beneath courteous smiles and surgical masks, ideal physician, but behind it she was a crazy, domineering, control-hungry person till she was prepared to destroy it. And I was the only one who saw it. 3 weeks ago, then, during the day, it's a secret that neither of us is willing to reveal. With the same composed untouchability, she issues commands without acknowledgement. I reply as if nothing had happened in her eyes, but the hallways are deserted. She finds me and takes me into storage when the emergency room is quiet and the lights are low. I'm called into Closet's office, where she shuts the door and presses me up against supply cabinets while her fingers dig into my... "You always drive me wild," she adds, with her hips and lips dragging over my throat. I tease her, but she never does, and I don't either. So stop making me reckless. Something between us is beginning to show in the daylight. She now gives me more attention during meetings, and I can see her staring when she When I'm attempting to chart vitals, I can't stop thinking about her hands, and she acts as though I'm not looking. I'm not sure how long we may continue to act as though I'm unsure since the calm doctor. Everyone else believes they are aware of her existence. But after hours, by the time the weekend rotation arrives, both she and I are completely freaking out. She was colder in the daytime and sharper now, and the tension between us was intolerable, more clinical than normal, such as the need to apply an additional layer of ice to make up for every second of heat behind closed doors, in public, and perhaps that helped the others. Perhaps the staff continued to see the same calm, unbeatable Dr. Morgan who never flinched or failed. But I was no longer duped, since I understood how she seemed with her hair untidy and she seemed to need something from me that she couldn't ask for aloud. And I knew what it was. Her breath was raggedly grasping my shoulders. When she whispered my name into the bend of my neck, her voice sounded like she was saying, "I shouldn't want you like." I knew her, and I was growing weary, as she dragged her claws down my spine, of acting as though I didn't know that we worked the identical 12-hour shift on Saturday. Back-to-back crises, too many walk-ins, and insufficient staff, she remained mute for the most part, while yelling commands, like avoiding me at all costs, as if she were terrified to touch a live wire. But when I rolled in Trauma Bay 3, I noticed her observing me repeatedly. When I laughed too loudly in the corridor, I pulled my sleeves up to halt a bleeder. Another nurse, particularly when I leaned over her workstation to grab supplies, while feigning not to notice her eyes, sear like a brand across my back. Instead of confronting her, I let her stew in it. When the tension broke at hour 10, I was leaving the on-call room after letting her resist the pull, which she refused to acknowledge. When I discovered her waiting in the shower after changing out my stain scrubs, my hair was still damp from a fast rinse. The corridor outside the door is empty, with the arms folded, the mouth closed, and the eyes unreadable, searching for me. I said, "Cool," and she stretched her jaw. "Do we need to talk?" I cocked my head and took a small step forward, sensing the familiar heat rising between us since you've been so explicit during the day, Doctor. And she detested my calls. Her nostrils flared as if it were a weapon, and I noticed her fingers twitching at her side, as if she wanted to seize me. Couldn't hear what she said, so I gave her 10 minutes to leave my office. Initially, my hips swayed with a practiced lack of concern, yet deep within me was, 10 minutes later, I was already running, so I knocked, pulled open the door, and discovered her standing with her back to me, head down and arms braced on her desk. "Before you resume acting as though I didn't ask, could you just tell me another secret? Don't exist." She didn't look back, and now that it's getting problematic, she remarked, "What are we doing? Describe the problem." I answered, entering the room and closing the door as, from my vantage point, it seems like the only aspect of my week that makes sense. Precisely the issue, she snapped, turning, and now her eyes are burning. "I shouldn't." I came in slowly and stalked her like prey. "Because I need you like this." "But you do." I approached her and flattened my palm on her as she whispered, which frightened me. Her muscles tensed in her abdomen. "Celeste, what are you so terrified of?" She breathed no, so I leaned in and brushed my lips over, making me forget who I am. Her jaw reminded me of you, and her hands tightly grasped my hips. "You're driving me crazy." "Then lose it," I muttered to her, and she pressed her lips against mine as if she were punishing us both for desiring this, her fingers slipping under the waistband of her mouth, her kiss full of teeth and longing. I gasped into her mouth, tangling my scrubs as if she needed skin to survive. When she whirled me around, my hands and her hair pulled her closer. I moaned her name without thinking. "Says to say it." As she pushed me against the wall. "It does," I murmured, arching. "Again," she growled, sliding her mouth down my throat. "Say it like it belongs to you." Against her, despite everything you had done to me. She persisted till we were in ruins and she was gasping for air. Her arms were locked around my waist and on my shoulder as if I were the only thing holding her to the ground. Remained like way for too long, entangled in fast heartbeats and silent sighs. Till I stared up at her as she eventually said, "I can't do this in pieces anymore." She drew back and caressed my face as though she was looking into my eyes, saying, "Then don't," observing me in a manner that no one had ever seen before. "You want all of me." "Yes," I answered in a harsh voice. She kissed me and said, "Even the parts one try to bury, especially those." Sweeter and slower this time, like a shift or a promise. And I knew something had altered. It was no longer merely a release. It was more than heat and concealment. Genuine. And we were on the verge of losing control permanently, so we refrained from verbally discussing what transpired in her office. At least she quickly and silently washed herself before hardly glancing at me. I leaned against the wall, arms crossed, and watched as she straightened her hair into a stiff bun and fastened her collar. My body was buzzing with aftershocks, and my skin was still tingling from her fingertips. However, she pretended that nothing had occurred, as if her mouth hadn't been on my throat. and I wasn't still gasping for her. When she finally turned to face me 5 minutes ago, her expression was tight. "I have a consultation," she said, her lips still puffy and her blouse buttons uneven. But she was professional, almost robotic. "In 15 minutes, she continued in a low voice. "Of course you do." And I replied dryly. Her jaw twitched as though she wanted to say something, but she hesitated just a little. "Something else." But she ignored me, unlocked the door, and departed, without saying goodbye or turning around. I remained behind because I needed a minute, maybe at 10, or during the entire night. I wasn't sure if I should laugh, yell, or run after her and make demands. Instead, I fell down the wall, head sliding back, chest still heaving. And she said, "What the hell is this between us?" Never desired someone as much as I desired her. And it wasn't just physical anymore. It was worse. It was in my mind. Even though she was halfway across the hospital, I could still feel her eyes on me. And the following day, she avoided me. She didn't even make eye contact during the surgical rounds, let alone page me once during my shift. Despite the fact that I could sense her presence in the staff lounge like a second heartbeat, I was in complete calm doctor mode, polished and unreadable. But I now knew better. 2 nights later, we were short because I understood what that look meant and what the constraint was concealing. 2 automobile crashes back to back with blood all over the place and screaming ER staff. I was elbowed deeply in a laceration when half the team overpowered me, breaking my ribs. She arrived with gloves on, her face steady and still, asking, "What do you need?" She questioned me. She nodded and applied direct pressure to the deep sutures on her left side, saying, "I've got the rest," and worked without reluctance next to me. And we moved for the next 20 minutes. She gave me equipment before I asked, so I followed her pace without attempting. It was flawless and easy, but it was worse in other ways, since even in the middle, I wanted to kiss her, rip the mask off her face, and ask her whether she still felt me in the midst of all that commotion. I tore off my gloves as soon as the last patient was stable and entered the vacant storage room across from trauma. She was there, breathless, flushed alive, and we looked as I just had time to close the door before it opened again. At one another for a moment, and then I replied, "You're making me crazy. You think I haven't been wandering around for days, trying to forget the taste of not already there?" She shot back. I stepped forward. "So why are you acting as though nothing is happening?" Because I'm not sure whether I'll be able to stop her voice shaking if I allow it to happen. "So don't I say chest?" She shakily breathed. "I don't want you to stop. Since it shouldn't be, you're a nurse, and I'm your supervisor." I acknowledged that, but it didn't stop you. Her eyes sparkled as she pinned me to your desk, saying, "Don't push me. Push you. Dr. Morgan, you are the one who initiated all of this." You laughed darkly and breathlessly, drew me in, gave me a kiss first, and said you couldn't stop thinking about. Don't stand there acting like I violated the line, because she moved closer. Her low growl in her voice may be what frightens me, since it makes me forget who I am. I've spent my entire life erecting walls and then tearing them down, so that's fortunate. She looked at me as if I had lit her on fire when I said, "Just once with me." And then she was on me, pressing me back with her body, with her hands in my hair and tongue crushing mine. It was teeth breath against the shelves. It wasn't tidy or elegant. Heat-induced gasps and fingers slipping beneath cloth, sometime between her hands tugging my scrub top over my. As her head and mouth traced a path down my chest, I understood that this was obsession rather than just stress. Mutual danger was irreversible when we fell on the floor of the storage room. She remained still for a while, her limbs knotted, her breath ragged, and her sweat drying between us. She simply slept next to me and stared at the ceiling for a while, before you finally spoke gently. I was terrified, so I looked at her and wondered why she had turned to face me. "You notice me, and I'm not sure how, and your expression is softer than I've ever seen it." I reached out and moved her hair aside from her face so that I could be seen. And then I let her see. After that night, something changed on the floor of the storage room, not only in herself, but also in the way she conducted herself throughout the hospital and the way she looked at me. Dr. Celeste Morgan, the pinnacle of elegance, is composed and peaceful, under strain. But now her skin had a hum, a charge, and an edge, and I felt it each time she glanced at me and her fingers touched mine. As we passed each other in the corridor, every time she whispered my name, there was a touch that went on for half a second too long. Low, authoritative voice that, regardless of who was in the room, made my knees tremble. We're smarter, more cautious, and better at hiding it now, but not the thick. The fire between us might be concealed by professional barriers, as seen by the way her eyes lingered on me during, the way she paused before leaving meetings in the morning reports. She began letting her hair fall out more frequently, allowing loose waves to gently brush her shoulders and soften them. Just enough of the mask was built to let me in, and I wasn't paying any more attention. I would lose track of where I was in the patient files while she was present. And every time I heard her, my heart would race. Heels clicked toward me down the corridor, But the issue with creating anything in the dark is that it ultimately begins to. It happened on a Thursday, and I was longing for the light, which was approaching quickly. Uneventful shift, nothing noteworthy, until Mr. Carlson, an elderly patient, refused therapy unless the kind nurse with the stern tongue, was there. As soon as Celeste and I walked into the exam room, the atmosphere changed. He remarked, "I've been watching you two come in together," and I grinned broadly. As a coincidence, I felt my tummy clench when I offered Celeste clearance. One of our greatest nurses. She gazed between us with a smile on her face. "The way she looks at you, doctor, is not hospital business, and I am aware of it." Celeste tensed for another reason. "Let's concentrate on your blood pressure," Mr. Carlson said. "Oh, it's rising just fine," his eyes sparkling as he watched the two of you. "Is preferable to watching television." We completed the check-in without saying anything further. But as soon as we left the room, I turned to her. "He's not wrong," she said, glancing back and forth down the hallway. "People are beginning to notice me." So I remarked, "I'm sick of acting like this." She didn't mean to say anything. "But you want others to know that I want you to." She blinked. "Stop acting like you're ashamed of what we are." That hit her. She remarked, quieter now, "Then stop hiding like you are." "And I'm no longer ashamed." She appeared to want to continue, but a voice over the intercom interrupted us. "Code blue," she said. "I see you repeat code blue." "See you." We ran, and suddenly we were moving again, with doctors, nurses, for the remainder of the day. However, something lingered between us that was thicker than the silence and louder than the well-oiled machine. I stayed up late that night to chart vitals at the nurse's station Celeste because of alarms. Didn't stop when she dropped a folded note on the counter a second time, and continued to walk. I opened the office with trembling fingers, but I didn't wait. She was already pacing as I entered, and her white cloak had disappeared. Her hair was wild about her shoulders, and her lipstick was stained. "Lock the door," she replied. I did. She turned to face me, her eyes blazing, and said, "You were right." "About what?" I took a heart-pounding step closer and said, "Say it." "I'm tired of hiding too. I guess I've desired you since the first time," she replied, her voice trembling. "I know," she stated, "that's what happened when you challenged me in front of a patient. But I didn't do it to gain your attention. Made me desire him even more." So I reached for her and cuddled her face. "Something isn't flawless, Celeste, but you're not a mistake," she added angrily, adding that you're the only thing that seems genuine. I kissed her for the first time in years, and she returned the kiss as if it were the only thing preventing her from disintegrating was that we took our time and didn't undress. I muttered, "Let's be us," and we simply stood there entwined in one another, breathing the same air. If they don't comprehend, we may demonstrate it to them. She drew back just enough to meet my eyes and approached the gallows. When the hospital fundraiser Saturday night arrived, my heart stopped. With me as my nurse, not as a staff person. "Are you certain?" I inquired with my, "I don't care once they see us together like that," she murmured, her throat hard. "Let them see." Instead of responding verbally, I gave her another, deeper kiss, with all we'd been keeping hidden. Saturday was quickly approaching, and when it did, there would be no more secrets or shadows. Just the composed doctor and woman walking hand in hand into the light. Who knew how insane she truly was? She wore black instead of white, lustrous black liquid that held onto her like midnight, and secrets sliced high at her hair coiled in the slit and low at the back. In a way that was free-spirited and sensual rather than professional. Stood in my green silk dress, my heels sharper than mine, in the entryway of her penthouse apartment, suddenly out of breath. For a little moment, none of us moved as I recalled a persistent scream in my throat. Celeste then came over to me and said in a whisper, "You came." I smiled chest-height. "You?" "Sure." "Trembling only," she said, reaching for my hand and touching it warmly. She whispered, "You should see yourself." She didn't kiss me because she didn't need to. "You look dangerous." The car trip to the fundraiser was silent, and my eyes whispered, "Everything wants to be afraid." Despite the silent tension that seemed to be like piano wire between us, she continued to look at my thighs when she believed that I continued observing her hands while she wasn't looking, recalling what they had done to me in her office in the still heat and darkness of areas that we should not have entered. This wasn't a locked call room, storage room, or closet. When we got out of the automobile, the cameras flashed like this. Public exposure. Speed. She put her fingers through mine without flinching and entered the ballroom as if she owned the evening. And perhaps she did, since nobody was able to turn away from the way she held me or the way I didn't conceal the rumors that began before we arrived at the first table. "Is that Dr. Morgan? Is she with someone?" I raised my chin up and felt her hand tighten as I watched them. Oh God, around mine whenever someone gazed for too long, yet she never once let go. "Well, that's a surprise," said the chief of surgery, lifting his glass upon seeing us. "Dr. Morgan, is this your date?" he said with ease, She said, yes, without a... He raised his eyebrows boldly and answered, she is... Her voice was cold and quiet. I turned to face her, but for a moment I was unable to breathe. Steady the correct move. She was already giving me a quick glance out of the corner of her eye. I'm here, and I picked you out for dinner. She didn't care about her hand, and we didn't sit with the other doctors as it went by in a flurry of tight smiles and narrowed eyes. Remained on my thigh under the table the whole time, making circles with her thumb that made my breath catch every... At one point, she moved closer to murmur something harmless that seemed like a danger or... I muttered, my lips scarcely moving. You're making me crazy. And she grinned. Without giving me a good... I was pulsing by the time the dancing began, with the urge to touch her in order to convince her to do anything without seeming as though we hadn't already. Crossed all the lines and carefully dragged me out onto the floor. She spun me once and said, they're all watching, and her body moved to mine as if it belonged there. I said, let them. Her mouth was at my ear when I returned to her embrace, saying, you have no idea how I begged you to take me home because I really wanted you right now. We didn't even reach the bedroom before she pushed me up against the front door and gave me a kiss like, I'm going to ruin you, she growled. You already have. The week of restraint had shattered her in two, hands dragging over every inch of my clothing, as if it were in her way, as if she had been waiting all night to get rid of it. I pulled at her gown's zipper, panting, as if she was learning it by heart. You wore this only to torment me. Naturally, I did. And she hissed as she pushed me onto the couch and crawled over me. You'll have to pay for it now. It was crazy. It wasn't Dr. Morgan. It was her. This was Celeste's raw, unrestrained mind, which they all admired. Hours later, when her head was resting on my shoulder and her fingers were intertwined with sheets that smelled of champagne and sweat, she spoke softly, as if it frightened her, and languidly stroked circles on my stomach. I turned to face her and repeated, I love you. Once more, grinned, kissed my cheek, neck, and shoulder, and said, I love you. I love you. I embraced her, drew her close, and kissed her till it didn't seem real, until it seemed to be the only thing that had ever been important in the... She made the coffee in the morning without assistance or pretense, dressed in a robe, and I have rounds at 10. Zozo, she said, her hair disheveled and skin smudged by everything we couldn't say. Said, and the whole hospital's going to be buzzing. You worried? Replied I. No, she responded, taking a cautious sip. Because I won't be hiding anything this time. There were no shadows or locked doors when we entered the hospital side by side. And when the whispers resumed, and she grinned as everyone perceived her as the serene physician. But only I was aware of the reality. After hours, she was a wildfire. And suddenly the hospital felt different now. Not because anything had changed formally, but because the darn place would burn if she wanted it to. Not due to staff meetings, new regulations, or memos regarding workplace boundaries, but rather because everyone was aware of Celeste and me, and they were frightfully calm. The ideal doctor had a weakness, which I called mine. And while no conversations had changed since no one spoke directly, and the atmosphere in each hallway had changed, stopped as we passed, raised their brows, and spoke after us like shadows, subtly but clearly that I didn't give a damn, and she didn't give credit either, moved down the hallways with her customary elegance, but her gaze was more open to me now, and her touch lingered a little. Her voice wasn't simply abrasive, it was also intimate when she called my name over the intercom and handed me a chart. She didn't back down or deny, but I could sense that she was preparing for something, waiting for the other shoe to drop while holding her breath beneath the surface. It arrived sooner than either of us had anticipated. I was recording vital signs on Monday afternoon when Marcella, the top administrative officer of the hospital, entered the stiff posture and sugar-coated menace Ivy at the nurse's station. She said with ease, my stomach fell when Morgan's asked you to be in the boardroom. She asked, why no? Marcella smiled tightly. But I'm sure you'll very quickly that the boardroom hallway had never been longer when Celeste was already inside when the door was opened, and she was standing erect. Every inch of her controlled body was clenched in hands, but I could see the tightness in her jaw. The remainder of the room was covered in clothes and boards, and I noticed how her fingers moved a little and how her eyes avoided mine. Marcella, the department leaders, entered behind me and closed the door, received complaints regarding the possibility of inappropriate behavior. When bias crossed professional lines, I opened my tongue to react. However, Celeste only slightly lifted one hand, so I paused and said, I'd want to speak first, she replied, her tone steady but quivering under the surface in us so that only I could hear. Yes, Marcella remarked while reclining. Celeste cautiously scanned the room before focusing on me, saying, Ivy Clark and I have a personal relationship that started off duty, and I won't deny it. Although it hasn't impacted our professional obligations, if you think it jeopardizes my standing here, feel that the presence of a lady who refuses to feel ashamed of who she loves will damage this hospital's reputation. Then go ahead and take me away. The quiet was so loud that my heart was thumping in my ears. She was prepared to lose everything, including herself. For me, began to move forward, but she stopped and said, "I won't let you take it." The fall for me, I took the initiative, put everything on the line. And I'm sorry, but one of the board members cleared his throat for a moment. "No one is recommending that you be kicked out, aren't you, Morgan?" she added, sharper now. Sincerely, if I were a man and Ivy were a wide-eyed receptionist, this conversation wouldn't even be taking place if it weren't for the most competent nurse I've ever dealt with, murmurs another board. The member raised her hand. "Doctor, please don't let anyone doubt your abilities. Therefore, don't doubt my right to love someone who pushes me, who sees me, and who improves me both inside and out." I had never seen her like this in a hospital before, not in the dark or during surgery. Of her apartment, even as she used her tongue, hands, and body to rip me apart. This was a lady who had suppressed everything too long, and when she finished, they didn't fire her, didn't even publicly chastise her. Yet the tension persisted like smoke in the air, and as we left that, her hand went into mine without reluctance as the room shoulders touched. "And you must do that," I said. "Yes, I did." And she added, "I've spent my entire life establishing a name for being quiet. You're the first loud thing I've ever desired." Later that evening, she brought me to her house without a word. Without slamming me or hastily undressing me, she simply walked me to her bedroom, took off her heels, and gazed at the walls or torn buttons off blouses. She muttered, "I don't want to keep you," and I meant what I said, as if I were at home. I stepped out of my clothing and into her arms, then stopped learning. Because I wanted to learn how to love you in the light of day. Said to do it, and she did it slowly and charmingly. She kissed every part of me as if it were a prayer or a map that she was learning by heart. As if she were creating something that boardrooms, politics, or fear couldn't break us. So we made love without pressure-free urgency, without acting as though neither of us was afraid of how much we depended on the other. And when her voice cracked against my ear as she fell into her arms, saying, "You're not just mine after hours anymore." "Good," I said. "I don't want the calm doctor I want," and held her closer. "You." Her smile was genuine and unadulterated, and she didn't conceal anything from me or herself for the first time after that. Nothing between us was concealed at night. There were no more covert looks or locked doors. No, we didn't pretend that she was merely my supervisor and I was merely a nurse. Make announcements and refrain from posting images. But the hospital was aware, and Celeste lost interest and began to stroll across the hallways with her head held high, her frightening presence somewhat diminished by something more profound, something I had never witnessed in her. The untamed nature hadn't disappeared. It had only changed. Yet she still gave me a hungry kiss when after a long day of leading, they caressed me even though they were by themselves, as if I were the only thing holding her down, directing the saving of lives. But now she did it with more than just necessity. I sensed her love and respect when she helped me get out of my scrubs after a in the manner she texted me throughout a lengthy emergency room visit. She kissed the back of my neck twice before taking a hot bath. "I'm observing you tonight, Hydra," as she began to sleep on my side of the bed more frequently than hers. Staff at the hospital kept their curiosity to themselves as they gradually adapted. Some nurses only muttered when they believed I couldn't hear them, but others, surprised, offered tacit, encouraging support. During rounds, someone murmured, "Good for you." She wanted someone to remind her that she wasn't invincible. But not everyone was. Subdued one evening during an especially hectic trauma intake. One of the more recent residents made a snarky remark that was loud enough to be mistaken for her. Favorites have advantages. I wasn't immediately responsive because I was concentrating on a patient and my blood-stained gloves. When Celeste heard it, her mind went into emergency mode, and she froze, looking up at the moment. The room fell silent as her gaze met his. "And you had 2 seconds to..." Calmly, she apologized. "Otherwise, I'll make sure you're never permitted to return to my..." The resident turned pale once more. "And I apologize, Dr. Morgan. I didn't mean one." "No," she answered. "It won't happen again." The discussion came to an end there. I discovered her pacing her office after the shift. "But you didn't have..." I answered softly. "Yes, I did." And she turned to face me. "I promise never to allow anyone to undermine the hard work you've put in here. You arrived here in spite of me, not because of me," whispered quietly, "because I was correct. And you saw something in me that no one else did." Whispered, "You're stronger than them all." "Are you?" I took a step toward you. I put my arms around her waist, but she kissed me slowly and deeply, proving that you don't always have to battle alone. Of something more profound than heat, containing all of the things we hadn't discussed throughout the previous week's storm. "Trust me." Her voice was no more than a whisper when she withdrew. "I'm sick of dividing our life between bags for the night, locker rooms, and your place that smells like..." I love you, she added, and I want to wake up to the fragrance of stale coffee. I want you in my space, in every aspect of my existence, and I want to go to sleep every day with you wearing my shirt. I was stunned as I gazed at her, and Celeste said, "Yes, you're serious. Have I ever not been serious? You're always serious," I responded, gasping for air, saying yes to the issue. She repeated it more softly now since she didn't want you to. "I want you to be my home, whether that means being my nurse or my secret." I kissed her like it was the only solution. And perhaps it was because we moved in together 3 days later. Too many shoes, disorganized boxes, and timetables. I would have lived on her couch simply to hear her laugh in the morning, but I didn't care that I didn't have enough closet space. Stole her robe, and as the evenings grew softer and quieter, we prepared dinner together, attempted to teach me how to play chess. I attempted to teach her how to let go, but she retained her fire, still possessed that imposing authority, but I was now involved, not just a bystander, escaped with. But one night after a long shift, we stood brushing our teeth with the person she had created something genuine with. Both of them are half asleep. Their hair is a tangle, their skin smells like soap. And hospital. She glanced at me in the mirror, her face revealing you, transformed me, and I grinned at my toothbrush. "How is it going for you?" I stretched for her hand and intertwined our fingers, and she stated it was terrifying. "I'm not letting you that weekend, so I'm not going anywhere good," she added. She took me to dinner with her mother on Monday, and by Friday, she had her hair down for morning rounds. Because we were living and not hiding, the hospital stopped whispering, boisterous. And each time I walked past her in the hallway, she gave me that look that no one else could have, which made me, even after all this time, I was able to recall exactly what everyone else had forgotten, and she was still perceived as the composed doctor. But only I realized that she was deeply in love after hours, and wholly inexorably mine. The tranquility didn't endure, it never does. At first, it was faint, but when something is this good, this uncommon, and this true, Celeste's look paused oddly after checking her email, missing dinner, and then closing her laptop screen. I didn't press her as soon as I entered the room. She was still, when I was stirring pasta in the kitchen, she was still putting her arms around my waist because she was still in love with me. After working long shifts, yet I could feel the same tension resurfacing beneath her in her lap on the couch. Skin that felt like something she had buried was beginning to breathe again. But one evening when I got home, she wasn't there and hadn't texted. No note, only the flat was dark and silent. And I waited for 10 minutes and 30 minutes. I heard the front door open at nearly midnight, and she entered, her coat soaked from, "You're late." "I know." I stood there with my hair curled at the edges and my expression unreadable. Her mouth opened and closed before she murmured quietly, "I'm sorry. Where were you?" Lastly, I had supper with a former coworker that I asked or who used to know you before I did. But she feared to ask a hospital board consultant. "Thomas," I replied, the type of person who usually lingered too long, arms slowly folding. "Why didn't you inform me after our meetings that Thomas?" "It wasn't like that." Her jaw tightened as you spoke. "Because I didn't want to argue about it, because that expression on your face that conveys that you don't trust me is not one I wanted to see." "Celeste, you've been keeping something from me for weeks," she added scathingly. "But something's happening. Doesn't it have nothing to do with him?" Because I moved closer and spoke in a lower voice now. Her eyes flashed with hurt, rage, and fear. But she didn't dispute that it was about you and something you hadn't yet told me. She took a seat slowly, as if the burden she had been carrying had finally caught up with her. "They offered me a job, said that a Boston hospital's chief of medicine tripled the budget completely. Research grant without conditions." I sensed the words before I understood them completely. "Boston acknowledged that they had been pursuing me for months before you. You didn't tell me that I didn't want to force you to pick." So I sank into the chair across from her. "Celeste, you didn't give me an opportunity to participate in the decision you already made. I haven't said yes, but you're considering it." So she stretched for my hand. She looked at me and asked if everything I had ever worked for was still what you wanted. Afterwards, it appeared as though she was considering the decision's edge for the first time. "You don't have to come with me," she muttered as I stared at her, my mouth rigid and chest cleft open. I'm afraid of relocating, Celeste. But I'm not afraid to ask you to give up all you've made here, of abandonment, silence, and brutality. And I never abandon you. I was attempting to protect you when I made that choice. But you were protecting, preventing you from becoming overly dependent on me. Her hand fell, and her voice was, she closed her eyes and took a deep breath, wondering what would happen if I spoke it. Since I first met her, I had seen the woman beneath the doctor, the one who is uncontrollable and unrestrained. "I don't know how to survive without you. Human might," she continued. "But I've always understood how to survive without everyone else." So I swallowed, and she allowed me to be the first thing she didn't leave. She approached me carefully, fell to her knees in front of my chair, and looked like, "Give up, come with me, Celeste." "I'm not asking you to follow me," she said, "requesting that you select us to work together to create something new." "What about the—" I cuddled her cheek and said, "Life we built here. We'll carry it with us. Truly believe that we already are capable of doing it." That evening, we laid in bed with our fingers. I was entwined, breathing the same air, and the idea of letting go of what was safe made every part of me hurt, everything I was familiar with. Yet I no longer feared her. Instead, I was driven to Boston by the fear of losing her. Yet I answered softly, "Do you believe they're prepared for the composed doctor?" But as she glanced at me, that ferocious spark only came back to her eyes if they never— "It's too late to find out my personality, but I said I'd bring the handcuffs." Her laugh was genuine and gentle, and her kiss wasn't a farewell, rather. It was when we left the city on a gloomy morning, the skyline was at the start of a brand new fire. With one hand on the wheel and the other resting on my thigh, Celeste drove while vanishing in the rearview mirror, was calm but attentive, not anxious. I had never seen her like that. Torn between, after spending hours studying her profile, I was able to recall every little change in her personality, her face as the miles went by. We didn't discuss Boston or what we were leaving behind since her hand was too big, too raw, and too soon. But I never let go of it. It was raining when we arrived in the city, and the new flat was immaculate. The walls are too white and the boxes unopened. It doesn't feel like ours yet. But she reached for me as soon as the door closed, her lips and fingers entwined in my shirt. Before I could even breathe, she found mine and kissed me as if I were the only one. Anchoring herself, "Tell me this isn't a mistake," she said. "You've never made a single mistake," which made sense in this new universe. "One with me," I said. And that night we slept with our blankets curled up on the floor, with fragments of our lives still unpacked. I rested my head on her breast and listened to her heartbeat till the following day was filled with chaos, meetings, and the opening of the new hospital was larger, more contemporary, and colder in ways that weren't able to be corrected by architecture or lighting. Yet they were aware of her identity. They treated her with the deference she was accustomed to, the title she earned, and the power she possessed naturally. I stayed quiet at the rear of the new staff nurse orientation session, attempting to fit in where she wasn't supposed to. I wasn't allowed to gaze, but she stared at me when she introduced herself at the front of the room. "I'm Dr. Celeste Morgan," and I think in order, she stated directly at me as I studied control and accuracy, but not when it comes to what really matters. And she gave me a tiny, piercing smile the night I pulled her into a supply closet. "You stared at me as if you had forgotten that you were my boss when you pushed her against the wall between rounds. But I remembered that I didn't care that you were going to grab us. I just put my hands on my hips and sighed. I kissed her till she groaned into my mouth. And as we parted ways, I said, "You're you?" "No," she retorted. "I'm finally the same person everywhere I am." Began working shifts during the week, which was difficult because I was no longer her nurse, was merely an additional face in the system, which was safe and clean, but it meant I had to earn my spot from the ground up. And even after doing so, people began with a gaze that was too long and a smile that lasted too long. Speaking once again, but this time there was appreciation and curiosity rather than distrust, not envy, and below it all was the feeling of inevitable fate. Same to everyone who encountered. Without having the specifics, everyone who encountered her recognized that I was the lightning that nobody saw coming. And together we didn't say sorry for who we were. Instead, we made room for it. One evening after 2 months, she arrived home later than normal, her mouth clenched, and she spilled, without saying talk to me. I poured whiskey into a glass and stood in the kitchen, claimed that the board brought up the relationship once more, and asked if I would like to reevaluate, disclosing that I had removed the glass from her grasp, put it down, and then asked, "What did you say that I asked, looking into her eyes. "Have no regrets." "Do you mean it?" She nodded. "But I'm still afraid that one day you'll examine all of this, the politics, the attention, the pressure, and make a decision." I cupped her cheek because it's too much, and I didn't follow you to Boston just to abandon you. "I need you to promise me anything," she said, leaning into my contact. "You won't forget the bits, no matter how crazy I go in private or how much control I lose around you, of me that still require holding." "Celeste," I said, drawing her close to me, You're the woman I want in every situation, not just the crazy doctor I secretly lust for." We shared an hour of light as well, making love on the kitchen floor without hurry or rolls, just skin, breath, and then we lay there with her head entangled in my tummy. "You recall the first time," she said softly, "I couldn't stop touching you." And I replied, "You are? I'm the one who shakes when you look at me like this." "Because now," I said, "there's nothing," she said, shaking, "between us. But in reality, she made breakfast without a shirt the following morning, wearing my ring, which I had given her privately, on a chain around her neck, without anyone else seeing. Stage was merely a declaration that what we had was genuine and would stay forever. Could still see the serene, ideal doctor in her, but I knew better, how deeply she saw it, how violently she kissed, and how completely foolishly she loved. And since she was mine and I was hers, no one else would ever see her like that. Without a ring, candles, or speech, she proposed to her in the middle of the night. Her eyes were a wild tangle from when she stood in our bedroom doorway, wearing only one of my t-shirts. She whispered, "Marry me," with a tone of slumber and a quietness in her voice that made everything else inside me become silent. I sat up slowly, my heart racing, and my breath was either a confession or a surrender. I stared at this woman who used to frighten me, give me orders with surgical accuracy, and touch me, as though she was terrified of having too many needs. "Are you serious?" "I've never been more serious in my life. You didn't even ask me with a ring. I obey the rules, so you didn't fall in love with me," she remarked as she walked across the room and got into bed, grazing my wrist with her fingers. "I never allowed anyone to fall in love with you because of the mess, the heat, and everything. Otherwise, you believe that marriage may contain everything," I said. Blinking through, she answered, "I think you can," in a voice like fire and truth. I didn't expect tears. Kissed her like if it were clear that the answer was yes, as if I had been waiting to say it each time she muttered, "I need you," against my throat, or sobbed my name behind locked doors after severing herself between my hands. Yes. We kept the engagement a secret from everyone at first. Ours is immaculate, unpolished, and quiet. We have matching tattoos on our ribs, but no rings. Her heartbeat line was inscribed in private, and it wrapped beneath her breast and mine, touching when we were lying down. A month later, she stood in front of the staff meeting, hand in mine, and spoke to the hospital, skin to skin. Stable as usual, she stated that this is an acknowledgement of the nurse you are all familiar with, not an announcement. As the most talented trauma nurse I've ever worked with, Ivy Clark is not only my colleague, but also my equal. The woman I'm being married to gasps in quiet, then loudly applauds, and she turned to face me in the midst of it and grinned as though I were the only person who had ever. It's crucial that the wedding was intimate, informal, and not conventional. It took place under the limbs of the same tree I used to lean on at night, in the hospital courtyard where we first met, shifts while feigning not to notice her passing by. She was wearing a white suit, and I was wearing a suit. We didn't write vows, and the dress that slid off one shoulder and revealed just enough ink to make me sad. I continued, "You taught me that control doesn't have to mean hiding that strength, doesn't?" As I gazed directly into her eyes, "You are my fire and my calm. So that wild silence doesn't mean anything." Saw me as though I were the only thing preserving her heart. "You demonstrated to me that I could get love at my—" "The riskiest thing I'll do is let someone truly see me, since giving up is a sign of weakness." When the officer said, "You may kiss, you are my home and my truth, the bride," I kissed her without hesitation, using everything I had battled to ensure our survival. And when she returned my kiss, the woman who had torn herself open for love was the only one present. The calm doctor was nowhere to be seen. Celeste was the only one who danced barefoot with me repeatedly, even though it worried her. She wore my jacket over her in the emergency room that night, long after the music had stopped and the courtyard had cleared out. Shoulders. I applied her lipstick to my neck, and she twirled me in the gentle light of fluorescent lights, and I said, "We should be exhausted," while laughing into her mouth. She muttered, "We should, but I believe I'm too in love to sleep." I pushed against the door once more as she locked it behind us as we followed her home. "I'll show you how crazy I can get for you." She mumbled, her lips in my jaw. She added, "I've already seen it." Unbuttoning my shirt and lowering herself to her knees, she caressed me that night as if she was remembering, yet she barely touched the surface. I held her on the way home as if I had never intended to let go. And when we eventually fell into each other's flesh, she stared at me, her breath gone, her legs entwined, and she murmured, "They can still call me. I'm the cool doctor for them, so that's okay." I rubbed my fingers across her hair, and her smile turned wickedly wild for me. "I will always be grateful to you, the person who loses control. I sincerely appreciate your help, whether it be through sharing, liking, commenting, or sending. Thank you so much for making a difference on the channel. I'll see you next."